This clip is from a much longer video linked down in the description. If you like this kind of content, check it out. We discuss more of the absolutely insane implications of the atheistic worldview. One of the more popular arguments for God's existence is from morality. We can date this argument certainly back to at least Aquinas, maybe even before him. C.S. Lewis has a very famous version of this argument as well. But in my estimation, what's actually more important than the great Christian thinkers who afforded these arguments are actually the atheists, because they have supplied and supported the premises for this argument over and over and over again. The argument typically goes something like this: that God is the only possible objective standard for moral values, duties, obligations, that sort of a thing. What follows from that? That if God does not exist, then there could be no such thing as moral obligation, moral value, moral duty. You couldn't have human rights. And then the second premise would be something like, those things do exist. We know that humans actually have rights. Every time you assert your right or somebody else's right in the political sphere, you are affirming that you believe the second premise, that morals, moral value, moral duty actually exists. But from the first two premises, what follows inescapably is that God therefore must exist. So how would atheists respond to the first premise? Like I mentioned earlier, the highest brow, the most credible atheist thinkers from very, very, very different schools of philosophy and intelligentsia and academia affirmed this first premise. So you have Nietzsche, who is an existentialist, you have the postmodernists like Michel Foucault, and you've even got the positivists like Bertrand Russell, all saying basically the same thing. If there's no God, there's no lawgiver, there's no moral arbiter, there's no judge who would make the discernment as to who is right and who is wrong when it comes to what is right and wrong. See, if God does not exist, then all we are the byproducts of time and chance, of the evolutionary process. And that means that we are by definition an accident. Accidents have no intention behind them. So if there's no God, there's no mind that wanted us, that intended for us to be here. If there's no intention, then that means that there is no meaning, because meaning comes from intention. There's no design, because again, design comes from a mind that intends for something to be a certain way. See, the mind has a thought that something should be a certain way, and that's called your design. But if there's no design, then there's no should. You can't say that humanity should behave this way or that way. You can only say humanity does behave this way and that way. In philosophy, we call this the fact-value distinction, or David Hume's famous is-ought. The Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy puts it like this: that people obey the law, or act honestly, or value money is one thing. That they should is obviously quite another. This is what led the very famous evolutionary biologist and atheist thinker Richard Dawkins to say this: in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, others are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties you should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, and what's the implication of that? Follow? No evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. You may say then, what of my moral intuitions? I feel that some things are truly right and wrong. Some things should never be done and some things should frequently be done. Again, if there's no God, then the only explanation for this would be the evolutionary process. These values, traits, beliefs, and behaviors simply came about because they provided our species some sort of survival benefit. Of course, that would imply that if we evolved from a species where forcible copulation and, say, social domination provided them a survival benefit, then we just would have evolved with a sense of morality that either allowed for or actually encouraged things like rape and patricide and oppression. In fact, it actually goes a good bit further than that. It's not simply that had our ancestors survived that way, then we would today possess these. It's that if in the future that social conditions or physical conditions arise in such a way to where those types of what we now consider evil behaviors do in fact promote the propagation of the species, then we should expect the human race to develop and grow into that type of a moral system instead of what we have today. Again, to quote Dawkins, DNA neither cares nor knows, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So for a lot of these thinkers, they're consistent intellectually enough to say there's no God, which means there's no moral arbiter, which means there's no law for us to actually, that we actually have to obey. But for many atheists, that's a bridge too far. They can't deny the second premise. They think, no, if I know anything, I know that there's certain things that are right and wrong. I know that the Holocaust was evil. I know that Hitler was not a morally neutral person. He was a morally evil person. I know that MLK is a morally good person, right? And so because of their commitment to the objectivity of right and wrong, then they look for an objective basis for morality outside of God. Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty are two of the more famous kind of atheist popularizers. And they both have attempted to show that you don't need God to have objective morality. And they say all you have to realize is that human flourishing is, or human well-being, is equivalent to what is good. Now, this is demonstrably false if you accept an atheistic worldview for at least two different reasons. First, there's no scientific definition. Science won't tell you what human flourishing looks like. Is it overall happiness by the most amount of people? Is it the propagation of the species? Is it sustainability and stability in our political structures? You could say maybe it's all three, but these commonly come into conflict with one another. And it has all the shortcomings of a basic utilitarian ethic, which would, if you're not aware of, would justify all sorts of atrocities because it would lead to the greater flourishing of the most people. The second problem, and far more fundamental, is the problem that it's completely and utterly arbitrary. The atheist thinker Steven Pinker points this out. We are simply accepting the flourishing of the human species because we're humans, which he likens to chauvinism or racism. It's just in-group, out-group morality. I'm this, I'm in this group, therefore the flourishing of this group is good. That's not in my group, so its flourishing doesn't really matter to me. But again, on atheism, why should I care about human propagation or human flourishing over, say, bacterial propagation or bacterial flourishing? Why should I care about over plant or animal flourishing? Why should I chop down a tree which is alive to build my house? And why should I wipe out a few billion bacteria that are inside my body using it as a host? Why am I putting my life over their lives, except that I'm just arbitrarily assuming that this spin-off of evolution is more important and more valuable than that spin-off of evolution? Without a God to justify this, to say that humans are made in his image, then there is no objective basis for delineating between these things. It's arbitrary, and therefore it fails to account for objective moral values and duties. Now, you may be asking, okay, well, if Steven Pinker sees that, how does he deal with this problem? And the answer is inconsistently, but we'll get to that here in a second. He tries to find a different moral basis, a different objective moral basis. So he says it can't simply be based on our humanity, because that's just in-group, out-group thinking on atheism. So what is it? He says, drawing from the work of philosophers like Michael Tooley, he says that certain humans, possess certain morally significant traits. These would be things like self-consciousness, self-reflection, plans for the future, an intentional choice not to die. But we actually have the same problem with this approach that we did for the other one. We're simply identifying what we have with what is good. So we have sentience, but why? Why would I value sentience or self-consciousness over brute strength or physical size or mass? Or how about length of life? Trees can live to be hundreds of years old, right? Why am I picking these specific traits and then calling them morally significant? It's the same thing that Sam Harris did. I'm arbitrarily picking my group as more important than another group. The second problem with this is that it leads to what are truly iniquitous conclusions. Both Michael Tooley and Steven Pinker use this line of thinking to justify to justify the killing of people who don't possess these traits. They both defend neonatal infanticide, and they say that it should not be considered murder. That's insane, or at least we should consider it to be. Now, I did mention that he is a relatively inconsistent thinker. While he will use words like should and should not in different contexts, he seems to adopt the rejectionist view, or the atheistic biological view of this, that in the end, what we consider to be moral is just a matter of brain chemistry, and therefore is actually just subjective. It's not objective. And he even goes so far, and I appreciate his consistency, he goes so far as to admit that this implies that atrocities like genocide and slavery, and he names them, aren't actually objectively evil. They're simply just distasteful. So let's review the intellectual cost of atheism. One, you can accept the in-group, out-group morality of Harris and Dillahunty and simply pay the intellectual cost of having no justification for that moral assertion. 2, you can pay the intellectual cost of simply saying that no, these things aren't actually evil. Rape and incest and murder and theft and fill in the blank of child abuse, that none of these are actually objectively wrong. I just don't like them, and that's the end of it. That both of those seem to me to be too high in intellectual cost, so you can accept the third option. God simply exists. Now, this video is not intended to argue for God's existence. It's simply to help you understand the intellectual cost of atheism. But at the end of each of the 4 things I want to discuss, I'll give a short case as to why God actually does explain these things. He's not simply the only other option, though he is, but he also is the best option. He makes a lot of sense of what we see in the world. So let's take morality now. I think that human flourishing actually is an objective standard, but that's because humans themselves are inherently valuable. Now, why are they inherently valuable? Well, in order to make a delineation or distinction that draws apart humans from the rest of the primate kingdom and all the rest of the species of living things, you would need a mind to make this assertion. There's a mind required to make this delineation. And this mind would therefore be the thing that gives humans its value. It establishes value. And this would also be the thing that this mind would be the thing that establishes moral order and moral rights and wrongs. And so you have something like a lawgiver, right? Which is a traditional way of saying God. And because moral laws are necessary in their existence, that justice can't be the opposite of justice. That's injustice. Justice has to be what it is. It cannot change because it's necessary. This mind itself also must be necessary. A necessarily existing moral mind or person is just what we mean when we say God.